Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great honor to extend a warm welcome to His Excellency, Mr. Ferdinand Marcos, President of the Republic of the Philippines. President Marcos won a landslide victory in the Philippines in June this year. Since then, he has worked with great energy to advance the well-being of his people and the global standing of his country. The global community has responded warmly to his efforts, and this is reflected in the continued inflows of foreign investment into the country and its economic advancement. In the third quarter of this year, the Philippines economy grew by 7.6%, among the best in ASEAN. Next year is also expected to do extremely well, driven by strong exports, robust domestic consumption, and infrastructure expenditure. Despite global headwinds, Microbank has been doing business in the Philippines for nearly 3 decades, opening our branch in Manila in 1995, and we are very confident about its future. It is therefore a great privilege for us to introduce the President today. Please welcome His Excellency, President Ferdinand Marcos.
Thank you, everyone. Good to see you, Mr. President. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the scene-setting session for the APEC CEO Summit. Today, we are to discuss the global economy and the future of APEC. My name is Tian Wei. It's such a pleasure to be the moderator for this distinguished panel. Before we have the brilliant minds speak, I will set the scene just a little bit. The reason we are talking about the global economy couldn't be clearer today. And the APEC, when we talk about the APEC, it's usually the APEC economies that we are so enthusiastic about. Of course, they are a vibrant and important component of the global economy, while at the same time, they're also very complementary to one another. The supply chains, the infrastructure capabilities, the talents and labor, and the list goes on. Today, when we are facing with tremendous challenges, I don't have to list them anymore, right? Everybody knows them very well. But many from here in this part of Asia Pacific are also looking at the opportunities as a result. And that is why we are having these 3 gentlemen coming from politics, business, international organizations sitting here with us. Also from different continents if you look at their citizenship. That's how inclusive this forum is. So we would love to invite their insights on the topic of the global economy and the future of APEC. So first of all, may I have the honor to have President of the Philippines, Mr. Ferdinand R. Marcos Jr., to present his views first. We have about 5 to 7 minutes for everyone. So Mr. President, please, you can sit and also deliver if you want. Okay.
Thank you very much, and good morning, dear friends, colleagues, and distinguished guests. Sawadee. It is pleasant to be able to speak with you and hear such a warm Thai greeting face to face. It is such a relief for us to be able to go back to the conduct of business in the way that we know is most efficient and most productive. Our smiles, our greetings are now unmuffled by face masks, from which we are slowly moving away, and our relaxed protocols of late are indeed a sign of better times. We now breathe easier, literally, as we usher in a period of moving forward with a guarded normalcy and optimism for our daily lives. Thank you, Madam Wei, for the kind introductions. I am very pleased to join Dr. Schwab and Mr. Moritz with all of you this morning. As I commend once again our host, Thailand, and the APEC Business Advisory Council of Thailand for organizing our first face-to-face APEC CEO Summit in 3 years. It's the fact that we are here is in itself already an achievement for APEC and for the Asia-Pacific region, as it is a testament to our pandemic response and its economic resilience. It is also clear evidence that our region continues to live up to its potential as a dynamo of cross-border trade and investment in the world. As member economies of APEC, we have a great opportunity to continue nurturing this potential and to continue responding to immediate and imminent challenges. After all, the economic miracles of the past 4 decades were performed by the economies of the Asia-Pacific, and APEC has been nothing less than a driving force of global economic growth. That growth was, of course, interrupted by the pandemic, and our recovery efforts this year have been challenged by soaring prices, supply chain bottlenecks, and serious geopolitical conflict. Dark clouds loom large if we are not to be prepared. They loom on the economic horizon, and now more than ever, our governments and economies must work closer and better together as partners in order to find that break in the clouds where the light of hope and progress can shine through. These shocks to our system have had, of course, a deleterious effect on our efforts of fostering inclusive growth. To prevent the situation from becoming a prolonged and self-perpetuating problem, we need to immediately address structural and policy issues with the objective of enabling rapid economic recovery and growth in a manner that creates jobs, includes more people into the mainstream, and reduces poverty and inequality. 3 issues, I believe, are critical to this effort. First, food security is a serious global problem. This is felt by every household, by every family, by everyone. The issues that the world faces now, from climate change to inflation to war, are viewed by the ordinary Filipino through the lens of food security. As these issues are very closely interconnected in this delicate system of the global food ecosystem. Steep declines in agricultural output and productivity from widespread damage to farms and to crops have been increasing, and they are linked to climate change, which has made extreme weather events such as unpredictable typhoons and severe droughts more frequent and more deadly. The rise in commodity prices, coupled with supply chain disruptions and inflationary pressures, have obviously contributed to the rising prices of food. And the current conflict between 2 of the world's largest agricultural producers has led to a scarcity of grains and fertilizers felt painfully across the globe. Food security must be a top priority for all governments, and developing economies especially must have the policy flexibility needed to ensure an increased domestic food production and diversification, and to improve the local agricultural supply and value chain. Second, we must continue to reinforce global health systems, not only against new and emerging variants of COVID, but also against other infectious diseases that may emerge. The global economy simply cannot afford another crippling series of lockdowns and travel bans that deflate consumer confidence, dampen the recovery of tourism, and derail the stability of global markets. Governments must continue to invest in pandemic preparedness and in ensuring the resilience of a global health system. Adopting the One Health approach and strengthening health surveillance systems for emerging and re-emerging infectious diseases from the human-animal environment interface can be part of the solution. During the pandemic, APEC played a vital role in fostering open and effective dialogue and international cooperation through the sharing of data and knowledge. Our good work in this area must never slow down, but rather feed into itself, strengthening the foundations and architecture of global health systems and improving the governance of pandemic agility, resilience, and of response. Third is climate change, the most pressing existential challenge of our time. The Philippines is among the countries at great risk from this crisis, as we stand to lose more than up to 6% of our GDP annually by 2100, according to a study by the ADB. Global agreements that seek multilateral and multinational solutions to the climate crisis, particularly the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change and the Paris Agreement, are there and they are in force. But not enough progress has actually been made as emissions continue to rise. The Conference of the Parties, the COP27, is in full swing, but stronger action is required. As the energy demands of the modern global economy continue to expand rapidly, diversification into renewables and other sources is imperative. And to this end, the Philippines has prioritized hydrothermal, geothermal, solar power, wind power, as well as other low-emission energy sources, by setting a target for 35% renewable energy in the power generation mix by 2030 and 50% by 2040. At the same time, the Philippine government will work closely with the private sector to improve the resilience of people and businesses by leveraging the tools of sustainability, such as innovative supply chain systems, circular economy models for recycling and upcycling, including, of course, the bio-circular green economy model of our APEC host, Thailand. The future of APEC lies in its ability to revitalize its role as the region that drives the global economy. The Putrajaya vision clearly shows us where we need to be in 2040, and APEC member countries must be ready to achieve that. It is a great vision. We will achieve it at variable speeds in order to effectively confront and overcome crises, economic or otherwise. APEC's size and dynamism, coupled with its strength in consensus building and implementing multi-year programs, makes it well-positioned for this task. APEC's future is also a nod to the past. We must leverage our region's core strengths and values as the premier forum in the Asia-Pacific, as an incubator of cutting-edge ideas, as a pathfinder for collaborative solutions to new and emerging trade issues, and as a laboratory for forward-looking and responsive economic and trade policies. Let us continue to build on APEC's long-running partnership with the private sector and be increasingly in lockstep with the APEC Business Advisory Council, which is the voice of the business community in the Asia-Pacific. These partnerships with the private sector are a centerpiece of the transformation of the Philippine economy. APEC's value and relevance are its ability to work with business. There is no other organization or forum that actively seeks the concerns of business the way APEC does, this tight engagement is what makes APEC unique, functional, and important. And therefore, it is an engagement that must not only be preserved, but it must be strengthened. Finally, global and regional economic governance platforms, such as APEC, are geared towards averting conflict. Like other similar post-World War II institutions, APEC should always remain cognizant of the raison d'etre of international economic cooperation. And we in APEC, I believe, have found that very difficult balance of very healthy competition and yet very healthy cooperation. However, the geopolitical currents that we must live with are some things that we still need to be concerned about. Because prosperity and progress is only possible in a world that is at peace, because we, as nations of the world, can never achieve our fullest potential unless we do it together. We must have our sights set high for APEC and for all member countries. But whatever plans we may have for our countries, for our economies, those will come to naught unless they are within the context of peace in the region and in the world. Thank you for the opportunity to share these thoughts with such an esteemed audience this morning. I thank you very much. And as we say in the Philippines, mabuhay po kayo.
Thank you so much, Mr. President. Please be seated, everyone. Thank you. Mr. President, thank you for sharing with us your insights as the first speaker of the panel. You set the scene for us by warning us of the dark clouds looming, for example, about health, about food security and climate change, but you didn't stop there. You provide the solutions and the core strengths of this region, and I think this is a wonderful start. Meanwhile, I will also love to invite the other two speakers to share with us their real insights. May I introduce the two of you together, and then we'll go one by talking to our audience. Thank you. Many in the room are so familiar with him. Professor Schwab is the chairman of the World Economic Forum. The forum, as many of you know, founded in 1971. That was a non-for-profit organization, and today it has become a wonderful international organization. So Professor Klaus Schwab, thank you. And also sitting on the panel, we have Mr. Robert Moritz, the global chairman of PricewaterhouseCoopers, who has been contributing a lot to our CEO forum over the years. And of course, his business is spanning more than 156 countries around the world. That makes him a global jet setter, I guess. Not only that, but also providing important input about policy from the business and the private sector, which is key, of course, to our CEO forum every year. So now let's invite the other two speakers to talk. First of all, Professor Schwab, please.
Mr. President, thank you for this very insightful speech, and I'm happy to be here with our partner, Bob, Moritz, and I see many distinguished partners of the World Economic Forum here in the room. Thank you for being with us today. Distinguished participants, when we look at the future of the world, we are not just confronted with a crisis. We are confronted, as it was also inherent in the speech of the Mr. President, we are confronted with a deep structural and systemic transformation of the world, which will preoccupy us not just as usually a crisis is doing for some months or maybe a year. No, it will be with us for several years, and it will have deep repercussions. Let me just describe to you maybe 4 factors which drive the economic transformation of the world. The first one, of course, is climate change and the need for energy transformation. We need, according to the International Energy Agency, we need to invest $4 trillion, which corresponds to about 4% of global GDP by 2030. Of course, short term, it's a burden, it's an investment. Long term, I see great opportunities coming out of it. Second driver of global transformation, of course, is the reshaping of our supply chains, the reshoring, based on creating more political resilience and of course the post-COVID factor. The third transformative force is certainly the need to internalize external costs. Just think of plastics. 10 billion tons of plastics floating into our oceans. And I'm very happy that on the occasion of the G20, the World Economic Forum, in cooperation with the G20 presidency, established the O20, which means a platform to integrate all efforts to create a blue Asian economy and to safeguard this very important resource of humankind. And I just want to mention some of the other risks into which we have to invest and where no action is certainly much more expensive than action. Just take cybersecurity. Just take the whole adaptation efforts. So what does it mean? It means a burden on our GDP because those are costs or investments into a long-term future. Now, when you are a company and you have restructuring costs, you write them off in your balance sheet, and of course it's the shareholders who suffer. But if you look at the global economy, the effect will be a reduction of purchasing power. And that's the reason why this economic restructuring will lead in many countries to quite some social tensions. Now let me go to the second part. What does it mean for business people in order to succeed? The cards are redistributed. And at the end of this transformation process, there will be winners and losers. Now, in order to be a winner and talking to the business community, I think there are 4 different dimensions you have to embrace. The first one, of course, is to embrace the 4th industrial revolution. I have written 5 years ago a book on the 4th industrial revolution, and I coined maybe this expression. This revolution is different from the 3 previous ones. It's a scope. It's not just one technology, it's multiple technologies reinforcing each another. It's a speed, it's exponential, and it's particularly also the fact that the winner takes it all. So the tendency is that the winner takes it all, because you cannot easily copy. You can copy a steam machine, or you can copy maybe a computer, but to copy artificial intelligence or the application of artificial intelligence in what you are doing is much more challenging. So if you embrace the 4th industrial revolution, it means to be at the forefront. You cannot lag behind anymore. Just to give you an example, even for my own organization, the World Economic Forum, I have to think in terms of the future. So we are establishing now what we call the Global Collaboration Village, which will be the first purpose-oriented, public goods-oriented application of metaverse, which means how can the world improve cooperation by using metaverse technologies. So it's embracing the 4th industrial revolution. Second, it's embracing strategic thinking. Since it is not a crisis where we have to look out for simple answers to very complex, that's usually the tendency how you solve a crisis, by applying simple answers to very complex situations. No, here we have to take also a systemic view. We have to connect the dots. Just look at nature and climate. It's not enough just to decarbonize companies. We have to look at nature-based solutions. We have to look at changes of lifestyle. We have to look at innovation and so on. So all those different activities are part of a systemic approach. And if I speak a systemic approach from a business point of view, it should be always opportunity-oriented. And I see great opportunities coming out of this transformation process. Now, the third recommendation, and Mr. President, you mentioned it, it's embraced public-private cooperation. Some people would say until the beginning of COVID, it was business who was the driving force. Then it has become governments. No, the solution for the future is that governments bring their coordinating capabilities to the table, and business its innovative capacity. And combined, this will create the winners. And finally, the last, and here I may mention, I will come back to one point you emphasized, Mr. President. It's a complementarity of regional and global efforts. The World Economic Forum has become now the international organization, as you mentioned, for public-private cooperation. We welcome very much those regional efforts, but ultimately they have to be integrated into a platform where global business leaders, governments, and regional business leaders and governments work together, because we need global solutions if we talk about the environment and many other of the challenges. Now, last, to conclude, is I saw the motto, rebuild trust. The business community, in order to build trust, has to adhere to what I call stakeholder capitalism, which means to work not only for profit, but to work for the people, for society, and the planet. I call it the 3P: economic progress, people, and planet. And here, key is walking the talk. It's not enough to talk about ESGs and to make big declarations, but Bob, we have worked very closely together in the forum to create metrics, how to measure ESGs, to make business accountable for a social role, an environmental role, which is a strong force for good and not just for economic progress, because business is part of society and will have the trust of society if it serves society. So, to conclude, if we embrace the notion of transformation, the notion of innovation, and particularly the notion of collaboration and cooperation, I think this transformation period will lead us into a much brighter future. It will, as we say in the forum, improve the state of the world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Schwab. As always, bringing us a lot of possibilities. It's wonderful that we see on the panel, we have a lot of can-do spirit, as long as we are making the real change. Earlier, just to follow up on what Professor just said, in the green room, every gentleman here talking on the stage today agree we are not going back to the year 2019. We are building something new, and that is where the opportunities are. Professor Schwab particularly mentioned about systemic changes, about complementary, further digging into that possibility, and about rebuilding trust, a different kind in a different era. And of course, eventually, as always, walk the talk. When it comes to walk the talk, I think Bob should talk. Now, Bob, because the businesses are supposed to present the deliverables, are supposed to really walk the talk. Tell me more about your thoughts on the general scene, of course, today, global economy and the future of APEC, please.
Not only myself personally to see so many friends and engage in new relationships, but also for PwC to continue to support the forum and all that it's trying to achieve. Let me build on the comments of the President and Klaus as we look at the world in front of us. Each of us can present a negative or a downward-looking view of the world that exists today with the many challenges. But the reality is humanity comes together when they have to face those challenges. And we can use it as a catalytic opportunity to change and drive the change that is needed for long-term sustainability, consistent with what Klaus had spoken about. The economy that we have today and the economy that has served us so well over the last number of decades is no longer fit for purpose. It needs to be rewired and rethought and reshaped and re-engineered in new and different ways. The reason I say that is because as we look at each region of the world, we see different perspectives. We see a very significant and acute problem in Europe with energy prices, inflation, and the effects of the war. In America and North America, you see an economy that is somewhat stable, but perhaps some slowing signs, but at least a consumer base that is still prevailing and moving forward. And here in Asia, you have underlying demographic trends that still need to be served, with a growing middle class, a large base, and a world of opportunities that exist. So what does this part of the world need to do differently in that rewiring or re-engineering? You saw in the video that PwC provided leading into this conversation the 5 forces. I want to bring a few of them together as we think about the concerns and challenges in a clogged supply chain. The supply chains that we have today were built for 20 years ago. They were focused on concentration in one location, the most effective and efficient quality at the cheapest price, and perhaps without regard to the world that the Klaus and the president ultimately looked at. What we see today from a supply chain perspective is this future perspective that there'll be more nearshoring or friendshoring as we think about supply chains more generally. But the reality is the business community will look at where can I tap into supply chains, no matter where they may be around the world, assuming they achieve the following few objectives. First, can it actually be shored up and solidified, effectively and efficiently be fit for purpose in the world that we see today with growing consumption coming out of the last 3 years? Second, how does it enable better decision making with more data, analytics, and real-time information to make much better decisions consistent with what Klaus talked about relevant to the 4th Industrial Revolution? And last but not least, how do we bring the ESG agenda into those supply chains now that will enable organizations to tap into them, countries to want them? And here, this part of the world is where you have a competitive advantage. That competitive advantage goes to the skills, humanity, and labor that rests in the countries that are part of this economic cooperative group. You have as well a concept of digital acumen that actually is much better than other parts of the world. And you have an environment where this group, when you talk to the CEO community and or the policy officials, more attuned to and focused on the E and the S of the ESG agenda, willing to make the necessary investments to drive the change. That is an opportunity to capitalize on. Now, as we think about supply chains, I would just ask us to broaden our thinking. A supply chain has to be more focused on the totality of the ecosystem and the totality of what the supply chain is about. First, making sure that you are thinking about the needed capital and where the financing of that capital will come, with the idea to reduce the friction or the blocks that exist to get to the capital into the right place. Here's where government and the private sector need to work together more so, enabled by the finance institutions, including the development banks, private equity, and others. Second, we have to think about labor, skills, people, and the opportunities as we think about their personal economic security and prosperity, and where they reside, and do they have the skills to help enable that potential supply chain. And third is to bring data into this, and I'm going to be somewhat provocative here. Some organizations and countries have actually done very well recently with a supply chain clog because they made faster decisions. They adjusted more quickly. So as we talk about the world in front of us, the concepts of resiliency, sustainability, and agility will be important. And here, when you look at the regional cooperation and coordination, you are seeing significant innovation and technology advancements. The challenge, I will argue, is how do we scale them more so for bigger impact? Impact to the economies, impact for better competitiveness, and impact for the citizens, not only here in the region, but also in the world. And I personally see the many clouds that exist, but the catalyst here is in fact the opportunities, particularly for this part of the world, hence the reason we're all here today, and hopefully we'll continue that conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Moritz. Now, the three speakers are the brilliant minds. Leave me with very little room to ask questions already. But let me do a little bit. I learned from Lao Tzu, one of the ancient philosophers in history. So I would love to ask questions from two ends of the same question. First of all, short-term versus long-term. Every one of us here face that question. You talk about investment. Wonderful. But where's the money? Short-term. What about the future? How do we know that? We love the directions you three gentlemen pointed to all of us in the Asia Pacific, but we cannot guarantee the certainty of the future you described. So what about short-term, long-term? Let's go with this way, yeah? Is it okay this time? Professor Schwab, briefly. Short-term, long-term.
Certainly, we have to think long-term, and as I mentioned, we have to think in strategic terms. This does not exclude to be very preoccupied with certain short-term issues. I'm thinking particularly, and here, by the way, this region has a great advantage with a higher macroeconomic stability in general compared to some of the European countries, because fiscal policies are now very difficult to be adopted in order to invest into the future. As you rightly said, we have squeezed out the national budget and the capabilities of government facilitating investments into the future. So business has to come in, whatever you can, and I would invest now as far as I can, and particularly invest into being at the top of the digital and green economy, because this will pay the dividends in the future, being at the forefront of the digital and green economy.
What about for a president of a country in the Asia Pacific? Short-term, long-term?
Well, I will be specific to the Philippine experience. Short-term issues are very simple. It is actually, at this point, it is survival for many of our people, simply because prices of fuel, prices of food has risen up to such an extent that they simply cannot afford to survive without assistance from the government. And hence, we are still presently in the Philippines providing just direct cash transfer payments. This is not something that we prefer to do. I don't think that anyone is particularly enamored with direct cash transfer payments, but it is the only way that we can mitigate the situation that our people have. So that is something that we are hoping, with the creation of jobs and with the growth of the economy, to slowly begin to dial down. And it is with the pandemic beginning to ease, at least in our case, then there's a great deal of hope that emergency situation will slowly resolve itself into some kind of normalcy. In the long term, there really are, I agree with Mr. Moritz, the changes that need to be made are structural. They have to be done structurally, because this is a different world, this is a different economy. And as we were discussing in the green room, he says, we're not playing catch up. And I said, even if you were, what are we trying to catch up to? 2019? I don't think that that's the plan. And so we have to be, we cannot be too married to the ideas that we were holding as truths before, and we have to be willing to make big changes, but with recognition that from what is actually happening around the world. But when we make these structural changes, I'd like to pick up on the point that Dr. Schwab made, is innovation. We must allow still innovation we must still continue to encourage innovation and to recognize innovations that can actually help and immediately put them into play, or put that, if it's a product, to market, or if it's a system, to implement that system. So the agility that Mr. Moritz is saying, I think, is the key to the future in the long term for not only the ASEAN, Asia-Pacific region, Indo-Pacific region, but for the whole world.
Thank you, Mr. President. Short-term, long-term, Mr. Moritz.
Let's be very clear for the politicians and the business leaders in the room. You actually need to survive the next 2 years to be able to thrive over the long term. And that requires you to deliver the trust and the outcomes and the immediacy to have the confidence and the trust of others to be willing to change for the long term. You need to deliver the results in the next 2 years to find the investment capacity to fuel the future. So as we think about this, it's a combination of two things. One is making sure you're delivering on the explicit needs in the short to enable the success in the long. Second is to describe and enable the journey. Right now, we talk about climate, for example, and Klaus's point and the president's points. It is not so black and white or binary to stop X and to move to Y. That'll be catastrophic to some economies and communities. It is the journey, a just and inclusive journey, that's going to be very important. And making sure that narrative is better understood by our stakeholders to better manage the short and long term is very, very important.
Second question. What kind of state of the world are we in, and therefore the Asia-Pacific region? Is it being defined as, I could use in many different languages to describe the same thing or similar things, but in English it will be rivalry, competition, or cooperation, which we have seen in trade mechanisms, at least in the Asia-Pacific region for decades. Maybe we start with Mr. President on that.
As I described, I think one of the great advantages that that APEC and the countries in the Indo-Pacific, Asia-Pacific region have been able to manage is that very difficult balance between cooperation and competition. And yet we seem to, for the most part, I would say we have done it. And that is what has driven the growth of the region, is that we are able to compete with one another. But when we find opportunities where partnerships will give the better result, we are all perfectly willing to enter into those partnerships as well. So that, I think, is going to be key. We have done it before. It is the nature of APEC. If we continue to do that and strengthen that, I think it will be to the great benefit of all countries.
Thank you. Professor?
I think we should not underestimate the social pressures which make governments in principle today more egoistic, because they have to serve their people first. But it's a responsibility, despite this situation, for business leaders and particularly for political leaders. And it is the helpfulness of organizations like APEC, like the World Economic Forum and so on, to remain the connectors on the global level. Because we never should forget, we are one humanity. And in the old ages, we had the village cooperations and we had national cooperation. Now we need global collaboration if we want to survive. Just look at climate change.
Let me analogize to PwC. There's days where we compete fiercely with our competitors. There's days we come together to collaborate on societal opportunities. And we did so working with the World Economic Forum, where the consulting and accounting firms came together to land a recommended set of metrics, because the challenge was not business and a P&L, it was societal. Likewise, countries and companies need to do the same. The challenges we see today, and COVID, it was one small example, albeit a challenging one, climate being the next, cannot be solved with competition in mind. And it does not limit itself to geographic borders or competitive landscapes. So it has to be compete when appropriate and collaborate as much as possible, to the extent possible. And as we sit here today, we are starting to see more signs where the world is trying to take those on, coming out of the G20 meetings or some of the other meetings that have been recently announced. And that hopefully gives us some more bright spot in the world of clouds that we see in front of us.
And I'm sure the fruitful results, shall I say, of the G20, particularly on the sidelines, many bilateral meetings, including between the two world's largest economies, going to bring us a lot of opportunity for cooperation as well. Last question. Oh my God, we only have 30 seconds left. Maybe we have 1 more minute for our speakers. Just very briefly, you all talk about building trust. It's not easy. Building trust or rebuilding trust. We know how difficult it is, especially over the past few years. We might not be able to see to each other in person. And we can see each other's shoes also, not just here through Zoom, right? So on that point, how that we can efficiently rebuild trust? Then I start with Mr. Moritz. Yeah.
Very quickly, but we're short on time. You need to engage and listen carefully. We have 2 ears and 1 mouth, twice as much listening, maybe singular talking from our own point of view. And second, the world we have lived in the last 3 years does not help. It creates more conflict or more risk of interpretation. We need to physically, as a human species, get back together again, socially and physically.
I like that. Human species. Yes. Mr. President, please.
In the political context, the way to earn trust is to perform. And the best politics, I always say, the best politics is performance, because it's something that cannot be taken away from you, and it is something that actually makes a difference in people's lives.
Walk the talk. Perform.
Perform, and you will get the trust back of the people, and that is what we all politicians, and I'm sure even people from the business side, that's what we strive for.
Thank you so much. Professor Schwab.
Short answer.
Microphone.
Short answer: to be trusted leaders. Now, what does it mean to be a leader and a trusted leader? You have to have brains, soul, heart, muscles, and good nerves. Let me explain. You have to be really professionals who look forward, strategists. So you have to have purpose. I think you get the trust if you show that you live up to a purpose. Finally, the heart. You have to do with passion what you are doing. And the muscles you have to translate into action and walk the talk. And finally, as we say, we are in a crisis preparing for better times. We have to have good nerves.
Thank you. Gentlemen, thank you so much. I think today we have a wonderful scene-setting panel. Not only deliverables for the short term, but also philosophical thinking into the future. Once again, warm applause to these speakers. Mr. President, Mr. Professor, and Mr. Chairman, thank you. Thank you so much.